We're back to our book again, Magic Elizabeth by Norma Kassirer, and we're on page 85, and this chapter is called The Doll. So here we go, because I want to see what happens. Sally petted and admired the kittens to her heart's content. Far above her, the voices of the grown-ups murmured. Aunt Trifoni's rocking chair creaked, and it all mingled with the crackling of the fire till it was hard to distinguish the various sounds from one another. "Time to go to bed," said her mother suddenly, but when Sally begged, "Please, just a little longer," her mother sighed and got up to stir the soup on the stove. Clink, clink went the spoon against the iron kettle. Mrs. Perkins took Bub upstairs to bed. The back door opened and let in a great swoosh of cold air as Sally's father, after ruffling her hair with his big hand, went out to see the horses. A feather of snowflakes drifted in through the open door, lifted, fell, and melted in the warm kitchen before the flakes touched the floor. And after a time, the shadow of Aunt Trifoni's rocking chair lay quite still on the hearth, for Aunt Trifoni had fallen asleep over her knitting. So it was that Sally, thoroughly happy, curled up and fell asleep by the fire, one hand still resting on Mrs. Niminy Piminy soft fur. She stirred and sighed when she felt a hand upon her shoulder. I'll move just a little closer. All right, back. She felt a hand upon her shoulder. "Sally," whispered a voice that seemed to be coming from very far away. Then, "Sally," it said again, closer this time. She opened her one eye and smiled sleepily. She closed the eye again immediately, for it seemed to her that it was Aunt Sarah who was bending over her, shaking her shoulder. "Come, Sally," said what was unmistakably the voice of Aunt Sarah. "You're awake now. Stand up." Sally opened both eyes this time. Yes, it was indeed Aunt Sarah, looking very cross. "Why, Mrs. Niminy Piminy," Sally said in surprise, for a black cat was curled up in the crook of her arm, purring quite happily. You came with me." She rubbed her cheek gratefully against the cat's silky fur. "Shadow seems to have taken a liking to you," said Aunt Sarah gruffly. "Shadow?" cried Sally, and this time she sat up and stared down at Shadow, who blinked up at what seemed to be a surprisingly friendly manner. She smiled back at him rather timidly, and then hesitantly reached out and touched the top of his head gently with the tips of her fingers. Shadow purred and rubbed his head against the fingers. "He likes to be petted under the chin, too," said Aunt Sarah. Sally gazed at Shadow, who looked very much as if he were waiting expectantly, and stroked him beneath the chin. Shadow lifted his throat luxuriously and poured out his contentment in a ripple of rising and falling purrs. "I didn't think you liked cats, Sally," said Aunt Sarah. Sally peeked up at Aunt Sarah and smiled shyly. "Oh, but I do," she said, and she wasn't afraid of Shadow any more, she thought. He seemed so much like Mrs. Niminy Piminy. But where was Mrs. Niminy Piminy? She looked into the mirror, but all that she saw was herself and Shadow and Aunt Sarah. Show you the picture. Aunt Sarah and Sally and Shadow. "Oh," she sighed, "it must have been a dream." "You did look as if you were dreaming," said Aunt Sarah. "You looked happier than I've ever seen you. It must have been a good dream." "Oh, it was," said Sally eagerly. "It was all about the other Sally, and Mrs. Niminy Piminy and the kittens." Her aunt was staring down at her. Sally's heart jolted, and she felt quite dizzy with anxiety. She remembered that her aunt had told her not to come to the attic. Sally looked down at the clothes she was wearing. Aunt Sarah must be furious with her for putting them on. She probably thought she had torn them. She would punish her for taking all the things out of the trunk. Her eyes turned miserably to the untidy piles on the floor. But her aunt, when she spoke, did not sound so much angry as puzzled. Mrs. Niminy Piminy, she said. How could you know? Oh, I see, she said, and her eyes lit upon the little book that still lay open on the floor. You read about her in the diary, I suppose. But come now, Sally, you've diddled and dawdled here quite long enough. It's past time for lunch, and you have all these things to put neatly away. I hope you know how to be neat. And just look at your clothes, all over there in a pile, all wrinkled and dirty. What would your mother say? Hurry now and take all those old things off. Yes, thought Sally, getting unhappily to her feet. That sounded more like Aunt Sarah she was used to, and yet she didn't sound nearly so furious as Sally had feared, and somehow she wasn't quite so afraid of her. I must be getting used to her, she thought. Besides, the happiness of her dream had stayed with her. Yes, the feeling of her dream had come back with her, and she was finding it quite hard not to smile. Oh my, cried Aunt Sarah as Sally rose to her feet and smoothed the long skirt. Sally looked anxiously at her. What had she done now? Those clothes, said Aunt Sarah, standing up like that, you look so much like the girl in the picture. Her voice faded to a trembling whisper. Sally continued to look at her aunt. How old she was. She hadn't really noticed before that Aunt Sarah was really a very old lady. Perhaps not quite as old as Aunt Tryphony, but very old indeed. After she had put everything back into the trunk with her aunt's assistance and was changing back into her own clothes, her aunt asked, What made you come up here, Sally? It seems to me that I asked you not to, she added severely. I'm sorry, said Sally in a voice muffled by the blouse she was pulling over her head. I was looking for Elizabeth. Did you say Elizabeth? asked her aunt sharply. As Sally's head appeared over the top of the blouse, Sally nodded. The doll in the picture, she said. Yes, I know, said her aunt impatiently, but the doll was lost a long time ago. Sally nodded. I know, on Christmas Eve. I didn't know that when I came up, but I read about it in the diary. How funny, she thought, to be talking to Aunt Sarah like this, just as if she was anybody. But I thought probably the other Sally found her after that. Well, you ought to have asked me, said her aunt. I would have saved you a lot of trouble. Sally stopped tying her shoe and looked up. Because, said her aunt, the doll was never found. Never? Sally's voice echoed her dismay around the attic. The very dust seemed to droop. Loose spirit. Her aunt shook her head from side to side. Never, she said. No one ever could find her again. Oh, that's terrible, cried Sally. Tears misted her eyes, and she sniffed and brushed them away. Terrible? Why so terrible? Snapped her aunt. Because, said Sally, the poor other Sally must have been so sad. She loved Elizabeth. Her aunt did not say anything for a moment. Then, sad, she said. I expect she was, but she got over it. People do. They grow up. I wish, said Sally. What? asked her aunt. I don't know. I guess that Elizabeth wasn't lost. No good wishing, Sally. Too much wishing in the world, not enough doing. But what could you do? About what, for goodness sake? Why, about finding Elizabeth. Oh, I'm sure I don't know. All that's over and done with. Shadow, called her aunt suddenly. Come over here. Sally could hear Shadow bumping around somewhere behind the trunks. There's a space between the floor and the ceiling, said her aunt, pointing, but Sally was not thinking about Shadow. You see where the roof slopes down, her aunt went on. It doesn't quite meet the floor, and Shadow loves to push things down in there. What are you up to, naughty boy? She asked fondly, looking down at him. For Shadow had trotted obediently over to Aunt Sarah and was rubbing up against her leg. Had Sally followed her aunt down from the attic from the attic, she was thinking to herself that maybe it wasn't over and done with. Her dream had seemed so very real that she couldn't feel that it was all over. And if Elizabeth had been lost in this very house, then why shouldn't she be found in this very house? Maybe I can find her, she thought. At least she was going to try, but where, she wondered, did you begin? At least she was going to try, but where, she wondered, did you begin? The next chapter is Mystery. And we're going to read it, beginning on page 94. What are you looking at? Asked Aunt Sarah as they were eating tuna fish sandwiches at the kitchen table. Sally swallowed a bite of her sandwich and said, "The kitchen. It all looks different." Different? Different from what? Well, different from my dreams, she said. Dreams, said Aunt Sarah, but she did not sound unkind. Well, tell me, how was it different? There was a fire in the fireplace, said Sally. Hadn't been a fire there for years, said Aunt Sarah. And they were all sitting around it. Aunt Tryphony and the other Sally's mother and her father and Mrs. Perkins and little Bub. He was awfully cute. Little Bub, said Aunt Sarah. Yes, I suppose he was. Cute, as you put it. How children do talk nowadays. But Sally scarcely heard her. Why, it's a mystery, she was saying. There's a real mystery in this house. What's a mystery? Asked Aunt Sarah. About Elizabeth. Aunt Sarah sighed. Still thinking about the doll, are you? Sally nodded. It is a real mystery because how could she get lost with everyone there in the room? How could she disappear from the top of the Christmas tree? Where could she go? Calm down, Sally. Don't talk with your mouth full. Aunt Sarah sighed again. I'm sure I don't know. She simply disappeared. That's all. No one's even thought about it for years and years till you came along. But it seems so funny, Sally insisted, almost forgetting that she was talking to Aunt Sarah, for she felt as if she was thinking out loud. Where could she have gone? Dolls can't walk. To her astonishment, Aunt Sarah smiled. A very small and rather bleak smile it was, perhaps, with somewhat the effect of the sun breaking through winter clouds. The other Sally, as you call her, she said, used to think that Elizabeth was a little bit magic. But what nonsense I'm talking. All I can say is that no one ever solved the mystery in all these years. And that's what it's going to stay, if you want to call it that, a mystery. Could she have been caught in the branches? Yes, that's it. Maybe she fell, and when they threw the tree out, but that would mean she really was gone. I expect they thought of that, said Aunt Sarah. Yes, they searched that tree needle by needle before it was burned, or probably they did. Then you really think they did? Cried Sally. Then maybe she is here. But how do you know? She asked. You know things in a family, said Aunt Sarah, standing up and beginning to clear the table. Sally, without thinking, began to help her as she did her mother at home, scraping and stacking the dishes upon the sink counter. Well, said Aunt Sarah, I didn't think modern children knew how to do things so nicely. Perhaps you are going to be some help to me after all. Sally guessed that this was the closest Aunt Sarah ever came to a real compliment, and despite the odd way in which it was put, she felt pleased. Shall I dry the dishes? She asked. You'll find a towel in that drawer over there. Sally opened the drawer. Inside she found a neat pile of folded dish towels and a very old-looking gingerbread boy cookie cutter. She lifted it out and looked at it. That's a very odd cookie cutter, said her aunt. No, that's a very old cookie cutter, said her aunt. Yes, said Sally. Sometimes my mother lets me help make gingerbread boys at home. We have a cutter too, but not so big or so old. Does she? Said Aunt Sarah, turning on the faucet. You make gingerbread boys together, do you? You like that, I suppose? Sally nodded and dropped the cutter back into the drawer. She took out a towel and began to dry the dishes. Neither of them spoke until the dishes were all done and put away. Sally was thinking, however, thinking about Elizabeth, thinking about the attic. Maybe there was a clue up there. Maybe if she looked very carefully she would find something. Summoning up all her bravery, she asked at last in a rather faltering voice, "I wonder if I could go back to the attic?" Her aunt turned from the cupboard into which she was placing the last of the dishes. She looked at her She looked at her. "Still dreaming about Elizabeth, are you? Well, perhaps tomorrow. We'll see. Right now, I think you better go outside and get some fresh air and sunshine. You can take Shadow out with you, now that the two of you are such friends." Well, thought Sally as she turned and walked toward the back door, it was better than nothing. Aunt Sarah had said perhaps. But it was going to be awfully hard waiting for tomorrow. Her throat was feeling a little sore, but she wasn't going to mention it. "Oh, and Sally," called her aunt as she and Shadow were going down the back steps of the porch to the tangled old garden, "I thought perhaps tomorrow we could, if you like, make some gingerbread cookies." But before Sally could reply, her aunt had closed the door and disappeared. Let's read one more chapter. This one is called A Friend. "Aunt Sarah's funny, isn't she?" Sally whispered to Shadow, but Shadow was busily cleaning his left ear with a paw and did not bother to reply. Was this ever a real garden? Sally wondered as they began to walk together through the tall weeds and grass. The breeze lifted her hair just as she had imagined it would. The soft fur of the foxtails brushed her knees, and Shadow sneezed as if perhaps they tickled his nose. She could see his tail moving through the grass, even when she lost sight of the rest of him. The whisper of the moving grass rose all around them. Sally remembered how it had looked to her from the window, like a green sea. She found that it was indeed a little like walking through water to make her way through the swaying grass. It flowed smoothly past her and resisted the movement of her legs, just as she remembered the water doing at the lake, where she sometimes stayed in the summertime. She closed her eyes and imagined that she was standing knee-deep in water. In a moment her mother would call to her from the shore. When she opened her eyes, she saw a glitter of white showing through the thrashing grass at her feet. She bent to pick it up. She straightened and looked at the bit of seashell curling up from the palm of her hand. For a moment it hardly seemed strange at all to find a seashell out here. It looked like a broken piece of one of the shells in the parlor cupboard. She put the bit of shell in her pocket, wondering how it had come to be out here. She walked on, looking at the ground for other shells and attempting at the same time to avoid the tangled bushes that tore at her hair and her clothes. She began to notice, through the reaching branches, the fallen underbrush, the overgrown weeds, faint ghosts of paths that once must have led about the garden. The other Sally must have walked here just like this, Shadow, she said, with Mrs. Niminy Piminy. She was a black cat just like you, only she was a lady, of course, and she lived in this very house, Shadow. Where are you? Very house, Shadow, where are you? For the cat had entirely disappeared from view. Now, how could he have done that? She wondered. She hadn't even seen him go. "Here, Shadow," she called. "Here, kitty, kitty, kitty." But there was no sign of Shadow that she could see anywhere in the garden. The branches of the apple tree stirred, spilling sun bangles through their leaves. Sally watched them tremble on the very tips of the swaying grass and then blow away to touch lightly on others. For a moment the entire garden shimmered. The pine trees, shaded by the building at the back of the garden, looked very solemn, dipping their dark tops to her as if they were bowing. The sun felt pleasantly warm on Sally's head. No one at all seemed to be moving in the apartment houses on either side of the garden. How strange that they would have looked to the other Sally. She looked up at the windows and remembered how the windows of these very buildings had seemed to stare at her only last night. Now they did not look frightening at all, only empty, as if no one lived behind them. There was no movement nor any sound either from Aunt Sally's house. Only up at the window of her own bedroom the yellow curtains fluttered in the breeze. How still it was! She might have been the only person awake in the whole world. The whispering of the grass sounded to Sally like the voices of the children who had played here long ago. The other Sally and Patience and little Bub. How nice it would be to have someone to play with. Shadow wasn't really very satisfactory, even when he was around. She missed her friends at home. Snap! The sudden noise made her jump. She looked up at the high wall of the apartment building beneath which she was standing. Just above her head, the cord of a window shade was swaying back and forth as if the shade had snapped up suddenly. To Sally's surprise, she saw beneath the shade and just showing over the edge of the windowsill a red ribbon tied in a neat bow. The bow was trembling. As Sally watched, the bow slowly rose and was followed by a bright yellow head, which was followed in turn by a pair of round blue eyes, a turned-up nose, and a curly mouth rather like Elizabeth's, which seemed to be trying hard not to tremble. The girl, for it was a girl, leaned out of the window and looked down at her. Two very long yellow braids slipped forward and hung out of the window against the brick wall. The girl raised her hand and took a bite from a cookie. She continued to stare solemnly down at Sally. Sally turned back, too surprised to say anything. "Do you want a cookie?" whispered the girl. "Yes," said Sally, and found that she was whispering too. The girl vanished again beneath the windowsill and shortly reappeared with another cookie in her hand. Leaning further out the window, she stretched an arm down to Sally. Sally stood up on her toes, braced herself against the building with one hand, and with the other reached up and took the cookie from the girl. The end of one of the dangling braids tickled Sally's cheek. Her hand brushed against vines which were growing up the sides of the building from Aunt Sarah's garden. Let's show you this picture. Wonder who the little girl is. I don't know. We're going to read and see. "Thank you," she said, and she looked at the cookie. It was a round one with crinkled edges and pink frosting. She took a bite. It's good," she said, swallowing and smiling up at the girl. "My mother made them," the girl said. "It's very good. Your mother must be a good cook." She ate some more of the cookie. "Yes, she is." They stared at each other while they ate cookies. "Would you like another?" offered the girl. Sally shook her head. "No, thanks," she said. "I just finished lunch." A silence fell between them. They both looked up while a bird sang briefly from the top of an apple tree. "What's your name?" Sally asked at last, shading her eyes against the sun and peering at the girl. "Emily." "Mine's Sally. Can you come out and play?" At this, the girl shook her head. Her braids thumped against the brick wall. The end of her pink tongue crept out and nervously touched her upper lip. "Do you live here?" asked Sally, feeling disappointed. Perhaps they could talk for a while. The girl nodded. "Do you live there?" she asked, pointing to the house with her half-eaten cookie. "No," said Sally. "I'm just visiting my Aunt Sarah." "Oh," said Emily. Her tongue darted out again. She leaned forward a little and lowered her voice so that Sally had to move even closer to hear her. There was no one living in that house for a long time. Her eyes grew very round and her mouth trembled as she stared at the house. It was all closed up. It was dark. To Sally's surprise, Emily shivered. "I know," said Sally, wondering what was wrong with Emily. "I'm almost 10 years old. How old are you?" 8, said Emily. 8 years and 2 months. She was not looking at Sally. Sally followed the direction of her gaze. Emily was looking up at the yellow curtains billowing at her windows. That's my room up there, said Sally, pointing. I have a little green fireplace. It's very old. Emily drew back from the window. Her braids slipped back inside over the sill. Goodbye, she whispered. Her hands reached up for the cord of the shade. Oh, don't go, cried Sally. Please don't go. I was just wishing for someone to talk to. Emily slowly lowered her head. Her lips moved as if she were about to speak, but she did not say anything. Her eyes flicked toward Aunt Sarah's house, and then she turned away. Sally looked up at her, feeling puzzled. Why, she's afraid, she thought, just like I was. Maybe the house has looked haunted to her all this time, with all those scraggly old bushes and that loose shutter creaking, and nobody living in it. And then Aunt Sarah had come. Maybe she was afraid of Aunt Sarah. Guess what, said Sally. I came here last night in all that rain, and it was very dark, and I was so afraid. I never saw this house before, or my Aunt Sarah either, and the house looked so spooky to me that I wanted to run away, she smiled. You did, Emily said. Really? The tip of one braid appeared over the sill. Aren't you afraid any more? No, said Sally. Didn't you ever think it looked scary here? Emily nodded her head vigorously up and down. Why, I wasn't even afraid of my aunt. I even thought maybe she was a witch. Emily stared down at her own hands, which looked quite frozen on the windowsill. She took a deep breath. That lady, she said, I saw her when she moved in with a black cat. She looked all bent over. But she isn't a witch at all, Sally went on. She's just very old. I guess she's not used to children. Imagine thinking she was a witch. Wasn't that funny? She laughed. Why, tomorrow we're even going to make some gingerbread cookies. A smile began very slowly up on Emily's face. The curly corners of her mouth curled even more, and then she gave what sounded like a very relieved giggle. The other braid appeared over the edge of the window. I like gingerbread cookies, she said. You know, said Sally, the house isn't really scary at all once you get used to it. It's just very old, like Aunt Sarah. It's awfully pretty inside. There's a melodeon. That's a little thing like a piano, and it plays a tune all by itself when you just walk through the room, even if you go on tiptoe. And besides that, she paused dramatically and looked up at Emily, who was giving her all the attention. There's a very old doll lost somewhere in the house. There's a very old doll lost someplace in the house. There's a picture of her on the wall of my room. She belonged to a girl who lived here a long time ago. No one's ever found her. Emily's eyes seemed to grow larger and became even deeper blue. I'm trying to find her, said Sally. Emily grinned. She seemed a quite different sort of girl now. It would be a great deal of fun to know. I'll ask my mother if I can come out and play, she said, and then she was gone. The last Sally saw of her for a time was the glittering tip of one flying braid. Then the window was empty except for the half-drawn shade and its dangling cord, moving slowly back and forth like a pendulum, ticking away the minutes while Sally waited. She picked up a twig from the ground and stroked the fur of a foxtail with it. A small green apple fell with a soft plopping sound and rolled away in the deep grass. Then Emily was back again. Her face beamed with her eagerness. My mother says I can come over for a little while, she said. I'll come around the front and through the alley, she pointed. Sally was making her way through the tangle of bushes at the side of the house next to Emily's apartment house when Emily herself burst through from the other side. She was wearing a pinafore covered with small yellow quarter moons that repeated the smile of her very own curly mouth. Hi, she said. Hi, said Sally. They pushed through the bushes into the garden. "What should we do?" Emily asked breathlessly. Sally looked around the garden, her eye lit upon the old barn with the interesting glimmer of red that she had seen from her window, showing in the crack between the doors. "Would you like to go into the barn?" she asked. Emily looked at the barn and then at Sally, and she nodded. "What's that red in there?" she asked. "I don't know. I've never been in there either." They walked through the blowing foxtails to the barn. "They tickle my legs," said Emily. "I know," said Sally. "They giggled just because it was wonderful to feel like old friends already." Reaching the barn, Sally pushed at the doors. The old doors squeaked and groaned as if they had not been subjected to such treatment in many years. The space between them widened enough to permit the two of them to slip through into the barn. At the first squeak, Emily's hand had slipped into Sally's, and so hand in hand, Emily a little behind, they entered. Sally blinked at the darkness inside. She could feel Emily's breath on the back of her neck, and she squeezed her hand, feeling a little frightened herself. The dirt floor was spongy beneath her feet. She could feel its coldness through the soles of her shoes. The barn smelled, as barns ought to, of dampness and long ago hay, and perhaps even of the horses who had once stood in the stalls. Sally imagined them turning their heads as the other Sally entered. Maybe she had carried sugar in her pocket for them, or an apple from her garden. Emily gave a little shuddering gasp behind her. "It's Shadow!" cried Sally, for there he was, sitting quite placidly on the high seat at the front of an enormous red sleigh. The runners of the sleigh rose in magnificent curves from the barn floor. "The sleigh in the diary," Sally said. The sleigh was standing between the two lines of stalls, illuminated from above, as if on a stage, by wavering ribbons of light that descended from holes in the roof of the barn. The sleigh itself was delicately frosted over with dust and silvery cobwebs. It looked enchanted to Sally, for it seemed to shine with a light of its own. A little silver step at the side of the sleigh winked invitingly. Sally looked down at Emily, who was now standing at her side, staring up in wonder at the beautiful sleigh. Her tongue darted out and touched her upper lip. "Don't be afraid," said Sally. Emily certainly seemed to be a very timid little girl, she thought. "It's only Shadow up there. He's a very nice cat." "I'm not afraid," Emily said. "I'm not afraid with you, Sally. It's pretty. It's a very pretty sleigh," she added gravely. "Let's get up into it," said Sally, feeling very brave. "All right," agreed Emily. "I'll go first," Sally offered. She placed one foot on the silver step and, holding on to a projecting edge of the sleigh, lifted the rest of herself up to the steep step and then onto the floor of the sleigh. The sleigh gave a profound sigh as she stepped into it, as if it, like the barn doors, had not been disturbed in years. Sally reached down and took Emily's hand and helped her up. Tiny cobwebs snapped soundlessly as they moved. The black leather seat was covered with a network of tiny cracks so that it looked like a map of some heretofore undiscovered land. A fat white spider, who had perhaps been sleeping up there, scuttled away along one of the cracks and disappeared over the side of the seat. They sat down on the splitting seat and looked up at Shadow, who blinked down at them from the driver's seat, his green eyes glowing. "Come on down, Shadow," Sally said. "I want you to meet Emily." Just as if he had understood, Shadow jumped down and sat between the two girls, rubbing against their sides in a friendly manner and purring. Sally stroked his fur. Emily hesitated only a moment before doing the same. Sally introduced Emily to him, and Emily took his paw and said gravely, "How do you do, Mr. Shadow?" Shadow purred his reply. Emily brushed her cheek against his head. "He's nice," she said. Sally nodded. "I used to be afraid of him," she said, as if that had been a long time ago. And indeed it did seem to be. She told Emily about the diary, about the other Sally and her cats. This must be the very sleigh she rode in, she said, on Christmas Eve, and I'll bet that she had Elizabeth with her. Who's Elizabeth? Asked Emily. The doll I'm going to find. I hope you do, said Emily, but how will you find her? I guess I'll just have to think very hard, and I'm going to look all through the attic for a clue, if Aunt Sarah lets me go back up there. You see, Elizabeth was on the top of a Christmas tree, and they were all singing, and when they looked again, Elizabeth was gone, and there was no one else in the room at all. It's very mysterious. It's a real mystery, agreed Emily. Maybe the cat saw what happened to her. They laughed. Do you think they did, Shadow? Sally asked. Did Mrs. Niminy-Piminy see what happened? As if in reply, Shadow pricked up his ears and then leaped gracefully down from the sleigh to the barn floor. He sat looking up at them, one ear cocked as if he were listening to something. Sally! A voice called. Shadow looked once at the two girls and then hurried to the barn doors. Here I am, Sally called. Just as Shadow reached the doors, the crooked fingers of Aunt Sarah's hand appeared at the edge of one of them. Emily gave a small frightened cry. Aunt Sarah's face showed in the space between the doors. She blinked, shaded her eyes with her hand, and peered up at them. Oh, there you are, she said, frowning into the darkness. Oh dear, Sally thought, she would frighten Emily. It's only Aunt Sarah, Emily, she whispered. Who's that with you? Asked Aunt Sarah. This is my friend Emily, Sally answered. Hello, Emily whispered. Hello, Emily, said Aunt Sarah briskly. You girls can play later. Hurry now, Sally. It's your mother on the phone. You may be going home tomorrow. Don't make her wait. Hurry. My mother? Sally cried. She looked at Emily. Please wait, she said, and jumped down from the sleigh. Emily nodded. Her hands were clasped tightly together in her lap. And that's the end of that chapter. And the next chapter is called The Decision. And we're stopping that there for today. We're going to stop on page 115. See what happens the rest of it tomorrow. Bye, y'all.